Welcome, everybody. My name is Nina Yetta. I'm one of the coordinators of Europe for Scotland, and we're currently live on Independence Live's YouTube channel. We are on Europe for Scotland's Facebook page and a bunch of other Facebook pages too. So wherever you're joining us from, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for being here, Billy.
Good evening.
How are you?
I'm very, very good. Very good, Nina. Looking forward to this.
Yes, me too. It was a long time in the making. We first started working on this in May, actually. So a lot of time has gone into this, and I'm so happy to have gotten to this day now that we're finally here. So yeah, it's a big day for us. Of course, lately there have been quite a lot of not so good days for Scotland, if you will, or for many of us. But tonight we really want to celebrate the rich European history of Scotland that Billy has been exploring for many, many years now. So the reason we asked Billy to work together on this film was because we really liked his book, The Scottish World. I have it here. I think many of you will have read it probably. And Billy, I'm curious, like, how did you first start working on this book?
Well, it really started from a working class childhood in the west of Scotland, where my family couldn't afford to go to exotic places like Blackpool and Morecambe and Isle of Man for their holidays. We went to a similar village in the east of Scotland where my grandmother lived. So that gave me an impetus to travel. So as soon as I was almost legal age, I was 15 actually, I started hitchhiking in Europe. I hitchhiked to Normandy in France. I had a pen pal in Rouen, and I went there. And what I remember is that my French was okay. I was quite good at languages at school. And the only words of English that my French pen pal's father had was the words of Robert Burns's song, My Heart is in the Highlands, in a very broad French accent. My heart is in the islands, my heart is not here. My heart is in the islands, a chasing the deer. But he also, he and his wife were big fans of French history, and especially of Marie Stuart, who's huge in French history, Mary Queen of Scots. And I think it was there that I first heard of Pierre de Ronsard, one of the Pléiades poets. And a wonderful quote that I've still got to this day, where Pierre de Ronsard praised young Mary, and he said, Écosse, tu dois avoir une gloire éternelle pour être le berceau d'une reine si belle. You must enjoy eternal glory, Scotland, to be the cradle of such a beautiful queen, which is a wonderful, wonderful quotation. In that trip to Rouen, I met another famous guy from Scotland, the racing driver, Jim Clark, who was driving in a big competition there near Rouen.
And but you were not hitchhiking with him, were you?
No, not quite, no. But he was a famous Scot, and I shook his hand as a fellow Scot. And then I hitchhiked to the Rhineland and stayed in various Jugendherbergen along in Boppard and Bingen and places like that, and Rudesheim, and loved seeing the place where the Lorelei legend was set. So I was very committed to traveling in Europe from a very young age. And the following summer, I went on a school trip to Russia because I was able to study Russian at Kilmarnock Academy. And there I came across the fact that Scottish Jacobite architects had built part of the summer palace, the Tsarskoye Selo, Paris, built by Charles Cameron. So everywhere I went, I found echoes of Scotland across Europe. And it gave me the desire, if you like, if I had the opportunity later in life to explore this and try and fill the gaps that most Scottish people didn't know about.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic story. I didn't know that it went back that long.
Yes.
And it started so early, and it's really exciting, like starting basically, as a teenager already.
That's right.
So, so we are looking at, just now we were talking about a long time, but I can tell you that it's only 10 minutes till we start screening our new film together. So a very close countdown now. But yeah,
One other interesting thing, Nina, was that when I started working in the BBC, initially, I made programs on Scottish working class history, oral history of places like the Dundee Jute Workers, but then I got interested in the migration into Scotland. So I did programs about the Lithuanians in Lanarkshire, the Irish in the west of Scotland, the Italians coming from the Abruzzi, and the Jewish community in Glasgow. And then I turned that on its head later on and started getting interested in Scots going abroad. And that was the beginning of making documentaries about the Scots going to Scandinavia and the Baltic and Germany and across Europe. So it's been something that's been part of my life literally since I was a teenage boy, and long may it continue.
For sure. I feel like you've come up with so many more stories even since publishing the book. You did the series on the Netherlands. And
that's right.
Yeah. But do you have a favorite anecdote that you encountered?
Well, there are many fascinating ones. But one of the ones that appeals to me is I'm from the Burns country, from Robert Burns country in Ayrshire. And one of the songs we learned as children was Scots Wha Hae wi' Wallace Led, which became a Scottish anthem. And I realised when I eventually studied Scottish literature at university that it was a song, although it was about Scottish independence, it was also about the French Revolution and the American Revolution. So it already had an international dimension to it. And during the radical risings of the 1790s and 1820 in Scotland, it was used as a radical song. And for example, there were bands arrested for playing it during the 1820 Weavers' Rising. Now that's fascinating in itself, but the actual history of the tune of Scots Wha Hae goes back to the Wars of Independence in the 14th century. It was played at Bannockburn. Therefore, when all the alliance took place, it was played by the Scottish soldiers who helped liberate France from the English occupation, along with Jehan La Pucelle, with the famous French hero, Joan of Arc. And the story is that as the Scottish soldiers approached the besieged city of Orleans, the Orleanais heard this tune in the background, and that gave them the strength to continue struggling and fighting. And because of that, it's still played today as a French march. It's called La Marche des Soldats de Robert Bruce, the March of the Soldiers of Robert Bruce, or La Marche qui a été jouée pour l'entrée triomphale de Jehan La Pucelle à Orléans, the march played on the occasion of Joan of Arc's triumphal entry into Orléans. And if you go on YouTube and put in La Marche des Soldats Écossais, there's about 10 fantastic videos come up of French soldiers playing Scots Wha Hae. And it's even used by the great composer Berlioz in the Rob Roy suite.
Oh, I think, have we lost Billy just now? He was making so many interesting points and clearly so enthusiastic about these connections between Scotland and Europe, and especially France.
Yes.
Sorry, Billy, we just lost you briefly.
I know, for some weird reason.
Yeah, I mean, technology, but it's beautiful to see your enthusiasm. And I can only say also, like, even with our campaign, we have all these national teams, and it's quite interesting to see these strong ties between the French and the Scots. In fact, even when we have when we discuss our national strategies, the French always tell us, culture, we have all that history. We don't even have to go into all these details about politics. We know Scotland, and we have all that shared history, and it's very beautiful. We still have 5 minutes to go before the film.
Okay.
So I don't know where you left it off, but you were talking about
that tune. Hey, I remember somebody telling me that when the Channel Tunnel was opened, the French soldiers at the opening ceremony played Scots Wahey. And I think that surprised Margaret Thatcher and the English delegation quite a bit. But they had no idea about this history going back centuries. Initially, when the Scottish soldiers arrived in France to help liberate the French and defeat the English at La Baugé, the local population was a bit wary of them. And they were referred to as des sacs à vin and des mangeurs de moutons, wine guzzlers and mutton eaters. But after they defeated the occupation army of the English in La Baugé, Vieille Baugé, they developed a French saying, fier comme un Écossais, as proud as a Scot, which is an old saw that's still there to this day. So it's a marvelous history. And I love different aspects of it, but if I could choose to go back to one incident from that history, I'd love to have been in Notre Dame Cathedral in New Year's Day, 1537, when Pierre de Ronsard described James V and his marriage to Madeleine de Valois. And I'll give you one verse. This is in the French. Son port histoire royale, son regard vigoureux, de vertu et d'honneur et de guerre amoureux, la douceur et la force illustrent son visage, comme si Vénus et Mars en avaient fait partage. And I translated that into Scots. His bearing was regal, his luck fua smedum, virtue, honour, and amorous engagement. Douceness and brechtver lifted up his face, as if Venus and Mars had conjoined at its maken. So that's Pierre de Ronsard translated into Scots for you.
Wow. That is very impressive. And at the same time, also, I feel very bad about myself right now because I studied French at school, but I could not understand a word of what you're saying.
Well, it's medieval French. It's old French.
I'm very rusty, my French. Yeah, it's such a long and beautiful history. We're now 3 minutes away, though, from the film.
Okay.
So let me just say a few words about the film.
Right.
So this is Europe for Scotland's third video that we are launching. Our first one was just a few months into, after launching our campaign. We had a video on the 5th anniversary of the EU referendum that actually Billy also appeared in, and that a lot of people from all over Europe appeared in, expressing solidarity for Scotland in their own language. And then we had a video narrated by Val McDermott on the 2nd anniversary of the Brexit Day, which has actually been really well received in Europe. It's been really nice to see that because Val explains so well what happened. And unfortunately, a lot of people in Europe don't know so well about Scotland's choice in the referendum, what happened afterwards. So but tonight is really, in my opinion, it's definitely the film that I'm the proudest of, that we worked on the longest. And it feels like the biggest achievement so far, or probably ever. And this film explores all these different ties between Scotland and Europe. As Billy has just explained, there's a huge range of stories. And what you are doing in your book is you look at these different countries, right? You go geographically. In our film, we do it a bit differently. So we look at the trade links between Scotland and Europe. We look at intellectual exchange. We look at, politics. And then some figures that had ties to both countries.
Yes.
And so I think we're about to see 1 minute to go. I've just learned from the producer. So,
thank you for your input in that, Nina. You come up with a few connections that I had been unaware of, so it was good to get another eye on the subject and bring in one or two people, for example, from Hungary, and Jules Verne in France. I didn't realise his Scottish connections, so together we've come up with a few good extra ones as well.
That's true. It was a pleasure working on it. Anyway, I think we're about to see it now. Oh,
Welcome to Scotland. My name is Billy Kay, and I'm a writer and broadcaster and author of the book, The Scottish World. Scotland is, and always was, a proud European nation. When David I, King of Scots, spoke to the inhabitants of his cities in the 12th century, they were addressed as Scotis et Anglis, Frankis et Flemingis, Scots, English, French and Flemish. So we have been a multinational, multilingual European country from our very beginnings. For centuries, trade between Scotland and European nations brought prosperity and cultural riches. One of the few artefacts we have from the patriot hero William Wallace is a letter to the city of Lübeck, then capital of the Hanseatic League, a medieval forerunner of the EU, which stretched from Tallinn in the east to Groningen in the west. Keen to see merchants from cities like Riga and Hamburg return to ports like Aberdeen and Dundee, Wallace informed the Hanseatic capital that Scotland was open for trade once again after liberation from English occupation. We had substantial Scottish merchant communities in European ports like Bergen and Bordeaux, Gothenburg and Gdansk, and as far east as Kėdainiai in Lithuania. In Poland, Scots formed a benevolent and self-help organisation called the Scottish Brotherhood, which had branches in 12 Polish cities. The Danish port of Elsinore not only had a thriving Scottish community, but the Lisle family were provosts of the town and directors of the Sound Toll. The Low Countries too attracted Scottish ships, merchants and migrants, and you can see their legacy in places like the Scottish Quay in Bruges in Belgium and the Scottish staple port in Fare, a little piece of Scotland in the Netherlands, and proudly celebrating that connection in the Scots Houses Museum to this day. As well as granting dual nationality for citizens of both countries, one of the major economic benefits of the Auld Alliance between Scotland and France were privileges in the wine trade. The red wine of Bordeaux, called Claret, became the national drink and bound Scotland and France so closely it was called the blood stream of the Auld Alliance. Later, Scottish merchants like Sandeman, Graham and Coburn also introduced the wines of Spain and Portugal, sherry, Madeira and port to a thriving home market, the beginning of close ties between Scotland and the Iberian Peninsula. Other important connections between Scotland and Europe were intellectual. Our early diaspora was hugely influential in all the countries we settled, due to our precocious ideal of educating the masses and teaching basic literacy to all the population from at least as early as the mid-16th century. It goes back even further to the Middle Ages when Schottenkloster, Scots-Irish monasteries, took early Christian teaching to southern Germany and Austria, where members of the Schottenstift were involved in creating the University of Vienna. In turn, universities in Scotland thrived thanks to Scots that studied at universities such as Bologna, Coimbra, Paris or Leiden, and then imported new ideas and methods they'd encountered there when they returned to become professors back at home. So successful were they that Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen became Europe's leading universities for medicine in the later 18th and 19th centuries. Many see the great intellectual achievements of the Scottish Enlightenment having its roots in this cultural interchange between Scotland and continental Europe. James Hutton, the father of modern geology, studied in Leiden, while the great philosopher David Hume and the father of economics Adam Smith travelled to France and Switzerland,
to strike up friendships with fellow luminaries such as Quesnay, Voltaire, and Rousseau. Voltaire later eulogized the influence of the Scottish Enlightenment. The Romantic movement in Scotland also had great impact across Europe. Composers from Berlioz to Bizet and from Donizetti to Mendelssohn were inspired by writers like Robert Burns and Sir Walter Scott. James Macpherson, in his guise as Ossian, influenced poets across the continent, among them Germany's Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Finland's Johann Ludwig Runeberg, and Hungary's Sándor Petőfi.
While Scottish themes influenced the thinking of political heroes such as Petőfi in Hungary and Garibaldi in Italy, Scots themselves were also deeply involved in European politics on many occasions.
In 1613, when peace was negotiated between Sweden and Denmark-Norway in the Treaty of Kinnared, the diplomats representing the two countries were James Spence of Wormiston for Sweden and Robert Anstruther for Denmark-Norway. They were not only both Scottish, but half-brothers from the East Neuk of Fife. One of our greatest romantic poets, George Gordon, Lord Byron, a son of Aberdeenshire, is still revered as a folk hero in Greece, where he died fighting for Greek independence in 1824. 2 decades later, the Scottish engineer Adam Clarke assisted the Hungarian Revolution in 1848 when he helped an estimated 70,000 men escape via the unfinished chain bridge whose construction he was overseeing. Clarke's grandson, Hajós György, became a famous Hungarian mathematician and is one of many great European figures who were proud to claim Scottish ancestry. Among them, the philosopher Immanuel Kant in Germany, the poet Mikhail Lermontov in Russia, the novelist Jules Verne in France, and the composer Edvard Grieg in Norway. In turn, many famous Scots are descendants of European settlers. The name of Sir Alexander Fleming, the famous Scottish doctor who discovered penicillin, reveals his distant Flemish ancestry. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, grew up the Scottish son of Irish parents. The pop star Paolo Nutini and the artist Sir Edoardo Paolozzi are just two of many famous Scots that trace their family roots back to Tuscany and the Abruzzi in Italy.
So Scotland was, and very much still is, a European nation, and today is home to the thousands of people from across Europe who contribute to the vibrant energy of our cosmopolitan cities, and as new Scots are valued members of our communities. EU citizens in Scotland share the aspirations of their brother and sister Scots to see Scotland renew those ancient ties with European countries, ties which were so undemocratically broken by Brexit. We appeal to our friends across Europe to help us restore Scotland to her rightful place as a sovereign nation at the heart of Europe.
I always get very emotional listening to the Scottish Symphony from Mendelssohn. So beautiful. Billy, I don't know. don't think I can hear you. Maybe you need to rejoin. I'm sorry about this. We noticed earlier that Billy's connection was sometimes a bit unstable, so we may have these moments during our event. But I very much hope that you all enjoyed this film. As I said, we've been working on it for 6 months, so it's really been a labor of love and a lot of effort.
Hello.
Yes, wonderful. We can hear you now.
Good. Good.
So yes, I was just saying what a labor of love it was working on this film. And of course, you've been working on stories like this for decades, as you were saying. And I mean, yeah, it just goes to show. And it's wonderful that like the passion that you feel for this and that you convey. It makes me emotional, even though I've worked so many hours on this
Hours
film.
on it. Yeah, the music, to hear Edvard
Yeah.
Grieg's music there is beautiful. Grieg's a fascinating character. He's a typical of the Scottish diaspora, and he's a hero of the Norwegian independence movement, as was another Scot, W.F.K. Christie, who's considered to be the diplomat who negotiated the first stage of Norwegian independence. And another famous Norwegian Scot is Petter Dass, who's a Baroque poet from the period. And that's one thing about working on the Scottish world. Every time I've done a programme, for example, in Troldhaugen, in Grieg's house in Bergen, I was told about Petter Dass, and I said, who is he? And they said, well, he was a poet originally from Dundee who became one of our most famous poets. And I was given a CD of his hymns. And when we launched the book, The Scottish World, I got friends of mine, traditional musicians, to do a version of that. And I translated Petter Dass into Scots. And again, it's in the book, so it's lovely to be involved in that. I think one of the interesting things is that a lot of people came to Scotland in the 19th century because of the Romantic movement, because of the success of Walter Scott and Robert Burns and the poems of Ossian. So you had Goethe being translated by Walter Scott, the Sorrows of Young Werther. You had Lermontov in Russia, who's a descendant from a man called Lermontov from here in Fife, writing poems influenced by Scott and influenced by the ballads, where he talks about his Scottish ancestry. And you have Pushkin translating poems like ballads like the Twa Corbies, the Two Crows, into Russian. And Scotland was fascinating for European intellectuals because of the Romantic writers. The Germans especially had this great expression, Die blaue Ferne, the blue yonder, and that kind of summed up the interest in Scotland. So you had great composers like Mendelssohn coming to the Hebrides to write his great overtures. And you had writers like Theodor Fontana coming over. But what happened when they got there was that, yes, the romance was there, but they also found themselves in the middle of the 19th century Industrial Revolution and the improvements going on the land. And the result of that was that, for example, Portuguese intellectuals like Christian Lage-Germa and Ludovic Pats came and discovered the revolution going on in the land. And Pats went back to Poland and implemented Scottish scientific methods on his estate in Poland and brought in Scots from East Lothian into Poland to look after the estates and brought in Scottish equipment. So they came for the Romance, but then they realised that it was a very modern and go-ahead country too. And that's a fascinating thing. And on the other side from Romance, for example, in Germany, in the 1843 uprising and the revolution of 1848, a Burns song, which opened our Scottish Parliament a few years ago, for all that and all that, it's coming yet for all that, and man to man the world hour shall brothers be for all that. Well, in German, that became a political song, Trotz alledem, Trotz alledem. There was very much a song of the radical movement in Germany in the middle of the 19th century. So we've always had that duality in Scotland. And what it's fascinating how old that connection is. I mean, it's probable that most Scots migrated to Poland and northern Germany in the 17th century, then went to Ireland, then went to Ulster. And when you think of the Ulster Scots and their influence today, and you think that maybe as many as 20, 30,000 Scots settled in Poland at that time, there was even a German phrase, I don't know the Polish, but I know the German version of it, which was, if you wanted to frighten a child to behave properly, they used to say, "Warte bis der Schotte kommt." You wait, or the Scots will come and take you away. A bit like the raggle-taggle gypsies, the Scots, because the Scots in that area were mainly peddlers. There were wealthy Scots in the big cities like Danzig and Warsaw, and they supplied young boys who took ship from Dundee and Aberdeen and Leith and went to these ports and were given a peddler's pack and were sent out to sell directly to the people in the country. So that goes way, way back, and you've got names that in Poland that look very Polish, but which hide the Scottish origin. MacLean became Makaliński. Weir became Wacher. Shochranek was originally Cochrane, etc., etc. So it's absolutely fascinating. And you've got great figures like Chopin visiting Scotland in that period and falling in love with the place. And he said,
some Scottish woman fell in love with him, no? That's what I read.
A lady called Stirling.
Yeah.
We think that she may have had a relationship. But he said about Scottish music, "I listen to the beautiful Scottish songs and feel like the E string of a violin," which is a very poetic way of describing it.
It's very beautiful. Billy, I would probably ask you to rejoin because I can hear your connection is cracking a bit.
Okay.
So we just have to do that a few times.
Very good.
Technology is not always our friend, but these are beautiful anecdotes. And I must say, like for me personally, growing up in Germany, going to school in Germany, we were of course studying the source of young Werther, and Werther was obsessed with Ossian, and so we learned a bit about Ossian at the time, and he actually inspired so many people. It's extraordinary. Like I read that Napoleon carried a copy of Ossian's work with him for all his, basically, since he was a young man, and up to the end, when he went to St. Helena, when he lost in Waterloo, they found Ossian among his books that he abandoned there when he fled. So it's just, it was a lifelong love affair. And I also remember reading that even the brothers Grimm, like that collected the fairy tales in Germany, were inspired by James Macpherson collecting these, collecting is a bit of a word. He was kind of inventing the stories potentially, but it's debatable to what extent he was inventing, to what extent he was collecting oral history, and that kind of inspired the brothers Grimm, who were very involved in the German national movement, to collect fairy tales. So it's just extraordinary, this influence, but also there was always a lot of reciprocity. So the Scots took inspiration from European figures, the Europeans took inspiration from the Scots, and it's just wonderful how your work points that out, because I think in general, my impression is people have a very clear idea across the world about Scotland, but the stories that they associate with Scotland, well, Mary Queen of Scots, fair enough. But with William Wallace, for instance, I absolutely loved that in our film, you point out the statesman-like figure that is writing to these people in the Hanseatic League and ensuring that trade will come to Scotland so that Scotland is doing well, rather than this kind of figure that we see everywhere on these statues with his sword in his hand, or a Braveheart, all of this. So it's just, you really, in my opinion, you really challenge this popular perception of Scotland by showing a different side.
Yes.
Is that also your intention?
Absolutely, and it was to try and give a more rounded version of Scotland. And interestingly, a lot of the people who did that migration, the wealthy merchants, brought their wealth back and invested it in Scotland. So my favourite castle in Scotland is Craigibar, and it was built by a man called Danzig Willie Forbes, who made his fortune in Gdansk, or Danzig, or Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen was funded by Robert Gordon, who was a merchant from Gdansk. The French connection, the intellectual connection that we've been talking about, is fascinating. That quote that we had on the screen from Voltaire is actually a concentrated version of a longer version that Voltaire made, waxing lyrical about the Scottish intellectual tradition. So that quote, although it's oft quoted from Voltaire, it was actually a précis of what he said. But other great French intellectuals, for example, Théodore Simon Jouffroy, referred to Scotland as cette illustre patrie de la civilisation, that illustrious homeland of civilization. And Charles de Rémusat and Victor Cousin, two great intellectuals of later 19th and early 20th century, one of them, de Rémusat, said about Scotland, "This nation must rank among the most enlightened in the universe. Politics, religion, and literature have made of Scotland something beyond compare." And the man who created the name, the Scottish Literary Renaissance, was a Frenchman called Denis Seurat from the Sorbonne in 1924. So there's been an ongoing connection with France, intellectual and artistic.
Yeah, it was beautiful. Like I thought this friendship. I know that David Hume and Rousseau eventually had a falling out, but in general, like these ties that were sought at the time, it was an elitist thing, I suppose, to some extent. But at the same time, yeah, it was something that, of course, now a lot of people can enjoy. Like there's a lot of people from Europe living in Scotland that have these Scottish friends, and vice versa. A lot of Scots that are involved in our campaign, living
Yes.
all over Europe, and so it's ties that very much continue. Even though, of course, we all know that Brexit makes it quite a lot harder at the moment, which is, of course, why we're working on changing that.
Yes.
But I wanted to come to your family because
Yes.
your family is like a microcosm to some extent of Europe. Your wife, João, is Portuguese.
Yeah.
Then you have 3 children that live in 3 different European countries. Unless I'm wrong, that's like in Germany and Belgium and Switzerland.
Yep.
And then you have all of them are married to people from, again, different European countries. So you also have Italy, England, and Russia in your family via your like in-laws. So how has that changed your perspective on European identity and Europe in general?
Well, it just enhanced it and built on the identity that was already there. I mean, one of my memories as when I was studying, I originally went to university because I was good at languages. I could speak reasonable French and German and got good qualifications. And from a working class background, you were able to get a full grant at that time, and I was able to go to university. But I've got memories of my dad coming home from the pub in Galston when I was about 14 and 15, bringing in stray Germans and Austrians and French people that he'd come across in the pub to come to the home to give them a drink of whiskey, but also for me to practice my French and German. So that I grew up with that, in my home background. But the family, I feel as if my family in some ways have regressed to an older Scottish identity that was very strongly existed. Before the accident of the fact that Britain in the 19th century and the United States in the 20th century, both being English-speaking countries, and Scotland having access to English, before that, Scotland was well known for its linguistic tradition. I think we were a bit like the Swedes or the Dutch. We could speak our local languages well, but we realized we had to communicate in other languages too. So, for example, in that Schottische Bruderschaft that we mentioned in the cities in Poland, the Scottish Brotherhood, the people had their records in German, in Scots, and in Polish. And they would also have used Latin as a lingua franca. So that Scottish tradition going back centuries in Europe is a very, very strong one. And that lasted through until comparatively recently. I mean, doing work about the Scottish missionaries, for example, I came across a man called Henry Brunton, who was in West Africa as a Presbyterian missionary. And he was the first person to formalize a native language called Susu in Sierra Leone. And 10 years later, he's in the Caucasus in the south of Russia, Ossetia, and he's translating the Tatar Turkish language, the Bible, into that language. This is the same man, another part of the world a few years later. So a phenomenal intellectual tradition that we called here the democratic intellect, the fact that widespread mass literacy came to Scotland very, very early, and access to higher education came to a much greater spread of society. And that's one of the reasons why we produced all these amazing characters. I'm also fascinated right through to the links with the Low Countries, because it was the links with the universities in the Low Countries that people now realise set the scene for the Scottish Enlightenment. So a lot of great Scottish intellectuals went to Leiden and Groningen, universities like that, and brought their ideas back and established them in Edinburgh, Glasgow, etc., etc. So it's an ongoing tradition. And in a way, my family are continuing that tradition by being so multilingual and multi-identity. And they're very, very lucky because they can all support Scotland, Portugal in the World Cup just now when Scotland's not there. So they're very, very lucky indeed.
That's true. You have a lot of options which can be root for. But yeah, I think it's also that's my personal experience, just speaking for myself. I mean, I'm German, my partner is Italian, we live in England. It definitely, you feel very privileged when you have this sort of, international group of friends, when you have all these experiences, and you at the same time you realize that if people had that experience, like all people had these access to these experiences, a lot of things like Brexit would not have happened.
Indeed.
And so it's definitely a privilege, and of course something that we want more people to be able to, if they want to, enjoy.
Yes.
But you were speaking about all these different languages that you speak, and of course your mother tongue, I guess I may say, is Scots.
Yes.
And so in addition to collecting all these stories about Scottish history, you're also a language activist.
Yes.
And now I wanted to ask you, a while ago you delivered a speech in the Scottish Parliament that I think was extremely well received by everybody who watched it, who listened to it, but also caused a lot of outrage afterwards on social media by a bunch of trolls. And I was really struck by that, because the outrage seemed to be entirely due to the fact that you were speaking in Scots. So it wasn't about what you said, but the language that you used. And that was really fascinating to me, because I grew up in northern Germany, and there are some people who speak Low German, but it's really a bit of not a dying language, I should not say that, but it's definitely something like as a everyday language, it's more like older generations speaking it, younger people don't really. And but there's a lot of efforts to preserve the language. So we had like competitions at school, reading texts in Low German, and then you could win a prize. So there was a lot of encouragement. And so it's just seeing that difference between this kind of like encouraging of speaking these languages in Germany, and then seeing the response to your speech really shocked me.
Yes.
And so I'm just interested in like your take on it, like if this rejection of the Scottish language and to some extent the Scottish culture among some Scots, if that is like a long-standing tradition, or if that is something that has escalated since Brexit.
I would say that it's escalated since Brexit, but it's also escalated because Scottish independence is a lot closer now, and people who identify with Britain, England before Scotland, feel threatened by that. So they're lashing out at any sign, any expression of Scottishness. It's a bizarre, bizarre thing. During the 19th century, the height of the British Empire, a lot of Scots could be very proudly, culturally Scottish and Scots and Gaelic speaking, but be in favour of the Union. I mean, Walter Scott is a classic example of that. But with the rise of modern Scottish nationalism and the desire for independence, some people find that threatening now and lash out at people like me who express it. Also, because of cultural colonization, people have been told that it's uncouth and uncool and belongs to the past to speak that way, ignoring the fact that all the great literature, all the great history is written in it. But if you're culturally colonized and then you see someone like me standing up, totally confident, delivering something in Scots, it caused the feet from them. It undermines a lot of the things that they've been told as children, that to get on, they have to go in an English direction and leave their Scottishness behind. Some people will say that's an exaggeration, but I could give you many, many examples of it. I mean, so, and the other thing is pure ignorance. A lot of people haven't been taught their literary and their linguistic history, so they believe that it's an uncouth dialect that nobody speaks except the working class, and don't realise that it was the language of kings and courtiers, and some of the greatest poets in medieval Europe wrote in Scots. Most Scots don't know that. They weren't educated as Scots. I was lucky in that I was able to do Scots and Scottish literature at university, and therefore my desire is to tell people what they missed out on. But it's a very strong thing. But on the competitions, we also, while we weren't allowed to speak Scots in class, we also got the Burns competition of reciting Burns's poems as children from the Burns Federation. So it's a strange mix-up of being proud of being Scottish, but being wary of it as well. I mean, a classic example that I recorded and I used in my series, the Cause, A History of Scottish Nationalism, which you can get on YouTube, actually, you can listen to them. It was where the education convener, a Labour education convener in Tayside region across the water from where I am, it was proposed that Scottish studies should be taught in the local schools. And his reply was, oh no, we live in a multicultural environment. In other words, he thought that he was being multicultural by ignoring the native culture. Every culture was to be taught except Scottish culture. And he thought he was being an internationalist by doing that. And that's how warped the perspective can become when you are culturally colonized.
I think from my perspective, I find that it's a very interesting aspect of Scottish nationalism. And in fact, we had a few days ago, we had a meeting, like a German team meeting for Europe for Scotland. And it was brought up how Scottish nationalism is really internationalist in its outlook. So in some ways, like your position is not unique. In some ways, you're speaking for a lot of people.
Yes.
And I think that is this inclusive nationalism where people can come to Scotland and be new Scots and be embraced by other Scots. And also, just wanting to be part of Europe, of the world, not feeling superior to other countries, but feeling proud of your own country is something I feel extremely inspired by, because I think, at least for me, coming from a country that really struggles with nationalism, obviously, for historical reasons, like I think at least like in general, progressives in Germany feel very uncomfortable about celebrating our own culture, to the point of like during another World Cup, when we had the World Cup in Germany and people were waving German flags, there were so many articles written in the papers at the time, if it's okay to wave a German flag during a football game. And, it was just something that people were not comfortable with. It has changed since, but, it's something super inspiring about Scotland. And I would say, in terms of people from different English regions, of course, people should speak in their accents they should speak, Northern English and all of that, and embrace their regional cultures too.
Yes.
And in general, I also wanted to ask you, because now we've watched this beautiful film about Scotland's relationship with Europe, and we have people watching us in other European countries. So if anybody now feels like they want to tell the story about their country's connection with Europe, whether they are French or, Dutch, or maybe indeed English or Welsh, like, how would you recommend they should start?
Well, there's a very good bibliography in my book, The Scottish World, which gives you the sources of a lot of these stories in the countries that they come from. For example, the Stuart's book, The Scots in Poland, or The Scots in Germany, or there's numerous books on the Old Alliance with France. So you would get access to them through my book, and it's a subject that's opened up a lot. For example, in Eastern Europe and Poland, for example, during the communist era, it went underground. But a lot more people are now working on that subject in Poland and Polish history. So it is being revived. On the subject of the inclusive nature of Scottish nationalism, I came across I recorded an interview a few years ago with a Japanese American piper in Hawaii. And he said something that I think most of us will agree with here. He said, "The only Scottish connection I have is with my name, Alan." His name was Alan Miyamura. Is with my name, Alan. But as far as being Scottish is concerned, I'm not of Scottish origin. I'm Japanese. But I truly believe that being Scottish is not necessarily a matter of blood, but a matter of the heart. And that sums it up. In other words, if you want to belong, you belong. We welcome people that want to belong to Scotland. That's the way we view the world. Das ist unsere Weltanschauung.
It's a beautiful and inspiring Weltanschauung.
Yeah, thank you.
And and then I just wanted to ask you to conclude, if and when Scotland becomes an independent country, would you also like to write a book about Scotland's relationship with England, which then hopefully would be a very friendly and, rich and productive partnership, I suppose?
It would be. But Nina, I would only do that if they first of all admitted publicly that it was us who taught them and then the rest of the world to play football. With the World Cup going on just now, everyone else, the Argentinians, recognised that Watson Hutton was the father of the Argentine football. You never get England admitting that. Instead of it, they sing that terrible dirge, "Football's coming home, it's coming home." Well, the only place football can ever come home to is Scotland, because this is where it developed. This is who created the modern passing game. Therefore, if there's a home for football to go to, it's here, and it's here.
We did receive, we once sent an email during the Olympics about curling being invented in Scotland, and we said at the time, we mentioned some other sports, tennis being invented in France, and then
golf,
we mentioned that, yes, but then we mentioned that football was invented or codified in England.
Yes.
And we got a lot of angry responses, for sure.
Indeed.
But yeah, no, I mean, I do think, I mean, we will see what happens. But in general, of course, there should be so much reason for affection between Scotland and England.
Of
and
course.
I think to some extent, I would compare it a little bit. I lived in a lot of house shares over the years, and quite often you just have housemates and you feel like, oh, do they really have to leave such a mess in the kitchen all the time, or invite people over that I really don't like, or sing in the shower at 5 a.m. or whatever, and then you move out, you have your separate places, and you're always so happy to see them.
Yes, indeed,
and,
indeed.
And
my wife speaks fluent Spanish and has great respect for Spain and has loads of Spanish friends. But she's first and foremost Portuguese, and she just longs for England and Scotland to have the same kind of relationship, you know. And that's the way it would be. Yeah. It would be like the Scandinavian countries. But first of all, we've got to get rid of the condescension and the yoke and the semi-colonial attitudes that unfortunately some English politicians still have to this day.
It definitely was very striking during Brexit negotiations. I mean, to be honest, like my view on all this, I never felt that I could really have a view, to be honest, as in I have never lived in Scotland. I came as a tourist.
Yeah.
But just seeing during the Brexit negotiations how Northern Ireland was just on nobody's radar, it felt, and yes. Scotland was completely ignored. And coming from Germany, where we have 16 federal states, and granted, you know, they vary in size. Our largest, most populous federal state is the same size as the Netherlands in terms of population, but we also have two small federal states, for instance, that are half the size of Glasgow each. And but these states are more respected within the Federal Republic than, you know, Scotland seems to be in the United Kingdom. So that was just really, really shocking to see and very eye-opening for me.
Yes. But the one good thing that will come out of Brexit is Scottish independence. And I'm convinced that that will happen, because I know several people who voted no in 2014 and who are now desperate to vote yes to make sure that Scotland rejoins Europe once again, as we celebrated at the end of the film.
Well, our campaign is firmly of the opinion that if Scotland rejoins the EU, then that also opens a lot of opportunities for England, because I think a lot of people in England, progressives, tend to be a bit pessimistic and think without the Scots, they're going to be a Trumpian country. And I don't believe that. I think if Scotland is having a wonderful time in Europe, then England will also find its way back. And then,
yes, I think we would be a catalyst for the English left to regain its purpose.
I think so too. But yeah, I think it's unfortunately the time has come to wrap things up. It's been such a wonderful evening for me. Thank you so much, Billy.
You're very welcome, Nina. It was an absolute pleasure to work with you.
Thank you. And I see also now that Billy's audio is again a bit not so working so well anymore. So maybe that's also a sign that we should conclude. But I've already seen in the comments that many of you have already gone to buy Billy's book. Thank you so much for doing that. I think you will not regret reading it. So I also wanted to just say a little bit about the film in terms of what we want to do with it, because tonight we are speaking, I mean, to a largely a Scottish audience, also people in Europe, of course, but like English people who speak very well English. But in general, like, we really want to reach a lot of Europeans with this film. We want to use it in our campaigning in Europe. As you know, our campaign wants to win a lot of European citizens, but also European politicians for our cause, to express vocally their solidarity for Scotland, and and just say that Scotland will be welcome back in the EU if it wants to rejoin. So I think this film will hopefully play a big role in our lobbying efforts. And so I'm extremely happy that we have it. And but one thing that I just wanted to briefly say is that, of course, it was a lot of work. It took a lot of time. And I wish we could kind of do more of this in less time. But right now, that's not very realistic, because it's really like we are so grassroots, operating on a shoestring budget. But if you want to support our campaign, and if you're in a position to do so, I should stress, I know times are tough right now, but if you're in a position to support us, consider helping us out a bit, and we can kind of create more content like this. I also wanted to thank everybody who has supported us already. Now that we finished this beautiful film, we can also start sending out our rewards that we wanted to send the people who donated, and hopefully that will arrive by Christmas. But thank you again, everybody, for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the film. Please share it with your friends. and people that you think might be interested in it. You will find it on our YouTube channel, europeforscotland.com. This is our website. Our YouTube channel is Europe for Scotland. But yeah, thank you again so much. Thank you, Billy.
Thank you.
And have a wonderful evening. And we will now show you just at the very end of this event a few images of gatherings that we organized in Europe on the day of the Supreme Court verdict, and which I think illustrate beautifully that this is always a two-way street. So all this affection for Scotland still exists in Europe, and even though it was extremely cold and so last minute that we knew that this was going to happen, people came out to just express their solidarity to Scotland. So you will see that in the video. But yeah, bye for now, and hopefully see you soon on our website or somewhere. Take care.
I am here to express our European solidarity and to tell Scots we stand with you.
La Brexit non deve essere il destino della Scozia.
Brexit must not be Scotland's destiny.
Das Licht für Schottland brennt in Europa weiter.
Europeans will always keep a light on for Scotland.
Wir, auch hier in München und in Deutschland, stehen hinter Schottland. Everybody for Scotland. We are behind your back.
Bon courage et à bientôt.